Where online, I have the handle Eileen codes, so that's Twitter, GitHub. I have a blog that I haven't written in 2 years, but it exists. And if I ever write something, it'll be on there. I'm a staff engineer at GitHub. I work on the application architecture Ruby language team. We work on setting standards, figuring out how to build stuff in Rails with Ruby, and we do a lot of work to improve the languages and frameworks that we use as part of Ruby. So we upstream a lot of tooling to Rails. We improve Ruby and performance stuff, so you all get all of that stuff from us too. I'm on the Rails core team. For those of you who are new to Rails and haven't heard of the core team, it's a group of engineers who work on the Rails framework. A lot of us are volunteers. Some of us get paid by our jobs to work on Rails, but for the most part, we do it because we love Rails. The core team is responsible for figuring out what the future of the framework is going to be, what features are going to go in the next release, when we're going to release a release, and all of that good stuff. So each year, I reflect back on what I've learned, the work that I've been doing, and what I'd like to share with you all at conferences this year. So when I started writing the abstract for this talk, I originally thought that I wanted to talk about the intimate details of upgrading Rails at GitHub. I had spent a year and a half upgrading GitHub from Rails 3.2 to 5.2, and I certainly could talk about it for many hours, maybe even days, until you were all bored. As I started to explore the themes around upgrading, I realized that there was a deeper story that I wanted to explore. I started pondering the following questions. How did we end up so far behind Rails Master in the first place? What past decisions caused our upgrade to be more difficult? What drove us to even upgrade when we were so far behind? And what does the future look like now that we're on Rails Master? So the story that I want to tell you is the story of the past, present, and future of Rails at GitHub. We've been using Rails at GitHub since day one, and at times Rails and GitHub have had our differences. Many years ago, we forked Rails and practically wrote our own version. We fought against the framework, we deviated from the framework, and we even wondered if Rails was right for us at all. But at the end of the day, Rails is successful because of GitHub, and GitHub is successful because of Rails. Our upgrade didn't just make for a good blog post for Hacker News to criticize. The Rails upgrade made it possible for us to use and invest in Rails for the long haul. We can change and influence the framework for our needs while also benefiting the broader Rails community and open source ecosystem. This story is part historical. We'll look back at the beginning and how GitHub ended up maintaining a custom fork of Rails 2. It's also part technical, exploring what compelled us to upgrade our process and why it was so difficult. We'll look at the costs of not upgrading and how technical debt accumulates in your application until your framework and application start to work against each other. Lastly, this story is part forward-looking. We'll dive into our effort at GitHub to clean up technical debt, our commitment to open source, and our responsibility to support Rails for the long haul. First, let's go back in time to the beginning. In 2004, DHH announced a new Ruby framework called Ruby on Rails. Immediately, Rails caught the attention of the Ruby community. At RubyConf that year, DHH talked about Rails, its history, how it came to be, and of course, why it was better than existing Ruby frameworks. He went on to talk about his philosophy in building the framework, most notably that many frameworks fail because they are built without an application in mind. He said that frameworks are retrospectives. They should be extracted, not built. Rails was attractive and successful, and is attractive and is successful, because it's extracted from a real application, basically. In the early years, Rails complexity grew slowly, and Rails 1.0 was released in December of 2005. 2 years later, Rails 1.2 was released. That same year, Tom Preston-Warner was at a Ruby meetup in San Francisco, and he showed his friend Chris Wainwright a tool called Grit. Grit is a Ruby tool that allows you to view Git repositories in an object-oriented way. It would become the basis for Git repos at GitHub. After seeing Grit, Chris was immediately hooked, and a few days later, GitHub was born. GitHub was created using the Rails 1.2.3 version, and after a short beta, GitHub was launched to the public in April of 2008. The next day, Rails moved from their own SVN server to GitHub. In 2009, Rails 2.3 was released. In the early days, when Rails would release a new version, GitHub would upgrade quickly to get the new features and bug fixes that that version had. But sometime between 2008 and 2009, GitHub had forked Rails. I couldn't find an exact date because we vendor our gems at GitHub, and there wasn't a commit that made it clear exactly when this happened, but it was sometime between these 2 years. I had always thought the reason that GitHub forked Rails was because Rails 3.0 was slow. And maybe some of you remember that, but many applications couldn't upgrade because of how slow it was. But it turns out that we'd forked Rails long before we even knew 3.0 was a problem. Now remember, this was the wild west of Rails startups. No one really knew what the future of Rails or GitHub was going to be. We weren't yet talking about the importance of upgrades or staying current on Rails master. Rails just actually wasn't as stable as it is today. I don't want to go as far as to say that Rails didn't care about performance or stability at this time, but I know a lot of app developers felt that way. And it certainly wasn't a concern the way it is now. Maybe that's because we were all kind of inexperienced back then. Or maybe it was because Rails was good enough for its most important user, Basecamp. Maybe it was because we, GitHub, didn't contribute enough upstream. I don't really know because I wasn't there, and I'm not criticizing the past, but it's important that we look at what we did wrong in the past so that we can improve for the future. The problem was that GitHub didn't just fork Rails and add a bug fix here or performance improvement there. It wasn't a fork with backports from upstream. GitHub's fork was Rails with custom code just for GitHub. It was a different Rails, Rails morphed to a different framework that was built for GitHub the way Rails is built for Basecamp. And as GitHub doubled down on their fork and added more and more functionality, of course Rails continued to progress at a fast pace as well. And no one could predict or understand the cost that forking Rails would have on GitHub's application or engineering team. In 2010, Rails 3.0 was released, but as I said earlier, many applications couldn't upgrade due to the performance concerns. The performance issues in 3.0 were a big deal. Users saw an unacceptable increase in response times, some applications seeing requests taking as much as twice as long. Active record in Rails 3 was found to be slower, 5 times slower than Rails 2. Despite knowing about the performance concerns, GitHub engineer Amit Gupta, also known as TM1, started work on upgrading GitHub from Rails 2.3 to 3 and Ruby 1.9. GitHub hadn't just forked Rails, we forked Ruby 2, which made upgrades way more difficult. And the Rails 3 upgrade wasn't pointing at Rails 3 master upstream. It was still a fork of Rails with custom patches from GitHub added on top. And I can tell you from experience that maintaining a fork while having to add all of your features on top of that fork and then also trying to upgrade is enough to make someone want to quit programming and be a goat farmer. So I really don't recommend it. In 2012, Rails 3.2 was released, and most of the performance concerns had been fixed by Aaron Patterson and other contributors. In the same year, after performance issues were fixed, GitHub's progress on the Rails upgrade stalled. It had been 2 years since they started the 3.0 upgrade, and the engineering team began questioning whether the effort was worth it at all. They asked each other, why upgrade when this version isn't causing us pain? Why upgrade when Rails 3.0 isn't so great? Why upgrade when our fork has more features? Looking at these questions, the engineering team decided the upgrade wasn't worth their time and focused their effort on other projects. The truth is that at this time, GitHub wasn't yet feeling the pain of their fork. And how do you convince an engineering team to upgrade when they're still feeling very productive? You make your tests faster when they feel too slow. You refactor a complex class when you need to add new functionality. But when do you upgrade? What's the incentive if the new version isn't better and it's working just fine? If you're not feeling the pain of being on a fork or an old version, you're not going to be compelled to upgrade. And so eventually, all of these why upgrade questions would become suffocating for the engineering team. It became harder and harder to find where the framework ended, and the application began as GitHub engineers started to fight against the fork and the application. Security backports were a nightmare. Each time Rails announced a new vulnerability, GitHub was forced to manually patch it. Hiring was becoming increasingly difficult. Nobody wanted to work on a Rails 3.3 application that doesn't even resemble Rails 2. It's harder to get up to speed. You can't Google search anything. Dependencies were brittle and unsupported as gem authors focused on new Rails versions. Development was slow and painful. Working with an application that's tied so heavily to a custom fork can make adding features or doing refactorings increasingly difficult. We realized that we needed to upgrade and get off a fork, or that fork was going to suffocate the application. So in 2014, a team of 4 full-time engineers and a few volunteers banded together, wrote an upgrade plan, and got to work. It took the team 6 months of full-time coordinated effort to upgrade to Rails 3.0 and deploy it to production, and a few months later, they deployed Rails 3.2 to production as well. It's important to remember here that 3.0 and 3.2 are still a fork with GitHub custom patches added in. By this time, the Rails 3 series was only receiving severe security patches, so even though the upgrade was a success, the code base and fork were still very far behind. The effort put into upgrading from 2.3 to 3.2 was massive, and motivation dwindled after that. It would be another 2 years before the Rails 4.0 upgrade was started. That same year, Rails 5.0 came out. I'm sure to some it felt like GitHub would never catch up if Rails was constantly improving and always releasing new versions. In 2017, I joined GitHub. At this point, the Rails 4.0 upgrade was not in a good place. There was no dedicated team working on it, the upgrade had fallen by the wayside. And so on my first day, I asked Hubot, hey, run the Rails 4 test, I want to see how bad it is. And so we do it, and Hubot says, hey, there's more than 4,000 errors going on here. Luckily, Hubot can't count, it's more like 2,000, so that's really easy, right? After the 3.0 upgrade, GitHub engineers had added some tooling that made Rails upgrades easier. We had a system that allows us to dual boot the application in multiple Rails versions. If you've seen Shopify's talks on this, we use a similar system to them, but it's different. This meant that we didn't need to maintain long-running branches. By adding the ability to dual boot the application, we can focus just on test failures instead of working with merge conflicts. Unfortunately, this method requires us to hack Bundler, but I would rather hack Bundler than have a fork of Rails, so that's worse. So with this method, we're able to boot the server, the console, and run all of the tests in multiple Rails versions, which makes it easy to compare and contrast behavior between the version that's in production and the version that we're upgrading to. It also allows us to incrementally upgrade Rails and prevent regressions. Whenever we have a build that's green, we make it required so that everyone has to write code in the new version, the new version we're upgrading to in the old version. So when the 4.0 build was green, we'd swap it out for 4.1, and we get to work on that, and then we swap that out, and we have to write code for 3.2 and 4.1, and that's how we did it, so that we could prevent new regressions in the code base for that version. In the application code, we used helper methods to easily condition different Rails versions. We always put the production version in the if clause, and all of the future code in the else. When we upgrade to 4.2, then the same tests that we already fixed for 4.0 won't start failing in the 3.2 branch of the code. In March of 2018, a year and 3 months after I started at GitHub, we deployed Rails 4.2 to production with 0 downtime and limited customer impact. After deploying 4.2 to production, I wanted to get started on 5.0 immediately because I didn't want us to lose momentum. Like, we were so close, but I was honestly very burned out. I had been the only engineer working full-time on the Rails upgrade, and I had a lot of other engineers helping me out, but they were on a volunteer basis. I couldn't force them to do the upgrade. Upgrading Rails was difficult and a lonely task, and I decided that there was no way that I would do the 5 series alone. So for the Rails 5 upgrade, we had a team of 4 full-time engineers, and by this time I learned what processes worked and what ones didn't. So I used GitHub projects and a tool that our CI has to create unique issues for every single unique failure so that we could track progress and prevent duplicated work. This also meant that any of those volunteers could easily just pop in, grab an issue, fix it, and then move on without having to ask me what to work on. Because we had a dedicated team and a streamlined process, the upgrade from 4.2 to 5.2 took only 5 months, and in August of 2018, we deployed 5.2 to production with 0 downtime and no customer impact. We had learned a lot. We had learned a lot from the 4.2 deploy, and we 4.2. We took a few months to actually deploy 4.2 because we hadn't done it before, and we didn't know what we should be worried about. But once we were on 5.2, we just kind of pushed it out. This was a huge milestone. It was the first time in 10 years that GitHub wasn't on a fork of Rails. It was the first time in 10 years that GitHub was on the most recent version of Rails. That's 10 years of cumulative technical debt, 10 years of fighting our fork in our application. We had finally started to pay that debt off. By upgrading, we didn't eliminate technical debt, but we created breathing room that the application hadn't had in a decade. I hope that learning about our upgrade hasn't scared you into not doing your own. The point of this talk isn't to tell horror stories. It's to show you that there's a cost to not upgrading, and that cost is cumulative. After hearing about the Rails upgrade at GitHub, I have had a lot of engineers come up to me and ask me how they can convince their leadership team to prioritize an upgrade along with the feature development. They don't have the resources, or it's not in their roadmap. It's not a priority for the company, or they think it's just going to be too expensive. It's true that upgrading is expensive and time-consuming, and I'm not going to lie to you and tell you otherwise. It's easier to say, this upgrade will need X number of engineers at Y number of dollars an hour for Z number of hours. You can measure this cost and decide whether this is too expensive or not. But at the end of the day, it doesn't matter how expensive the dollar amount of upgrading your application will be, because the cost of not upgrading is immeasurable. Not upgrading your application will eventually cost more money than any upgrade because of the way the debt accumulates in your application. When you don't upgrade Rails, you have to become a security expert. The Rails core team only supports patching security vulnerabilities in the major current version and the major version before that. So currently, we only support master 5.2, 5.1, 5.0, and 4.2. But when 6.0 comes out, 4.2 is gone. So we're not going to support it anymore. And I know a lot of you in this room are on 4.2, because I've met a lot of people who are on 4.2, so I assume that you are on 4.2. If you're using that version, then your team ends up being responsible for understanding and patching the security vulnerabilities yourself. It's very hard to get this right, because we on the Rails team aren't going to outright reveal how to exploit the vulnerabilities so that we can protect users of Rails who haven't upgraded yet. Not upgrading requires you and your team to be responsible for patching security vulnerabilities. When you don't upgrade Rails, you lose out on great talent. Bootcamp grads, college grads, all kinds of new engineers that are coming into Rails are not learning Rails 2.3, and they're certainly not learning your weird custom fork. Those engineers not only don't want to work on an old version, they just don't have the knowledge to understand how it worked. Engineers will turn down the opportunity to work for you if you're on an old version because that version doesn't let them contribute upstream, it's no longer Googleable, and it's 10 years old. When you don't upgrade, some of the gems that you rely on will get abandoned and deprecated, so you'll either have to live with bugs or fork yet another dependency. And don't get me wrong, the answer to this problem is not to roll your own. New gems may not support old versions of Rails, so you won't even be able to use those if you're on an old unsupported version. This makes development so much harder. Every choice of dependency becomes more and more difficult because you're so far behind. Maintaining old gems on top of your old framework gets tedious very quickly. And when you don't upgrade Rails, you end up building more and more infrastructure on top of your fragile application. I've seen this firsthand at GitHub. We have tons of infrastructure code in our app, multiple databases, CI tooling, our own job queue, and probably things that I have yet to find. Ideally, your application would consist only of code that makes up your product. GitHub's value is not in that we have code to make multiple databases run. Our value is in our community, our issues, our repos. Multiple databases allows us to keep our application up and running, but it is not why people buy our product. This infrastructure code makes development more painful because of how tightly it couples our application to Rails internals. Minor changes can easily turn into major refactorings or abandoned projects. The biggest cost of not upgrading Rails is that someday, someone at your company will decide that using Rails is a mistake, and that it's time to carve your application up into microservices. No, this isn't a language war talk. I'm not criticizing Go. You want to write Go, that's fine, I don't care. But we're at RailsConf, so I'm going to at least assume that you like writing Rails. I love writing Rails. I want to keep getting paid to write Rails. And it might seem like an exaggeration, but if we don't upgrade Rails, we don't get to keep writing Rails. The Rails ecosystem won't improve, our applications will degrade, and we'll be faced with an expensive rewrite. And if you think upgrades cost a lot of money, rewrites come with a hefty price tag as well. They might even cost you your job. The key to upgrading Rails is to incrementally pay off cumulative technical debt that you've incurred, and then figure out a plan to keep that debt paid down. I won't stand here and tell you that upgrading Rails will be easy. I'll leave that to the person on Hacker News who wondered why I couldn't do it faster, because their upgrade took a weekend. Clearly, we're doing something. The upgrade did take a long time, but it wasn't the only thing that we worked on during this period of time. I took time to delete features, I rewrote our custom test framework, I improved our handling for multiple databases in test and development. It's unfair for anyone to look at our upgrade timeline and decide that using Rails is too expensive. We made choices at GitHub that made upgrading harder. You have made choices in your application that will make upgrading harder. But that doesn't mean that Rails is a bad choice. Technical debt is real, and you and your team need to make decisions about what technical debt is acceptable and what needs to be cleaned up. At GitHub, we've decided that being behind Rails Master is no longer technical debt that we're willing to put up with. You can slowly work on technical debt and upgrade Rails to get your application in a better place. There are a few things that you should consider when upgrading and mistakes that you want to avoid so you don't end up doing a 7-year upgrade like we did at GitHub. The first most important step is to build out a team. Upgrades are really difficult, and it helps to have a team that can support each other, bounce ideas off of, and make sure the motivation stays up. If you have a one-person upgrade team and that person leaves the company, the upgrade is going to stop or at least be severely stalled. Make sure to create redundancy and support for such a difficult and lonely task. If you have a small team and you really need to upgrade, consider hiring a contracting firm like Testable to help you get out of the weeds. It will be expensive, but cheaper than not upgrading. They also can help you institute best practices so that you don't end up so far behind Rails Master in the future. You can also make Rails upgrades easier by taking the time to plan your upgrade. Your team should ask, do we want to upgrade incrementally from 3.2 to 4.0 to 4.1, or do you want to just rip the Band-Aid off and go straight to 5.2? You may want to use incremental upgrades because then you can see deprecation warnings, or you may just want to say, our tests are awesome and we can just do it. Our upgrade at GitHub, I knew it was going to be long enough that it made sense to work incrementally so that we could stay motivated. If we had tried to go straight to 5.2 and it had taken more than a year, it was going to be kind of difficult to convince leadership that we should keep doing it. It's kind of like, oh look, we did it, and then we did it again and again and again. So they were all happy about that. You should also consider that if you want to do the 2 branches thing, or if you want to have a dual booting CI, the dual booting CI can really help you pay debt down up front so that you make your future upgrades easier. If you do the long running branch, sometimes that can be really difficult to keep up with features that are going into master. You can also make your upgrades easier by fixing deprecation warnings early. Instead of ignoring them to take care of for the next version, consider fixing them as soon as you see them. Some deprecations are related to major changes, and they'll actually block your upgrade until you fix them. If you have ever worked with the alias method chain deprecation, your app basically just can't boot if you have that deprecation warning. So you want to fix that before you get to the point where you just have to wait for those to be fixed, because if you fix them, then you can see all of the failures and know how far behind you are. Otherwise, you're just stuck with alias method chain for your entire life. Once you've upgraded to the most recent version, make a plan for future upgrades. How often is your team willing to upgrade Rails in the future? Are you interested in testing new releases of Rails in the beta or release candidate phase? This can help make upgrades smoother for everyone else, because you can tell us on the Rails team what was hard, and we can fix it before we release that version. If you can't run Rails Master in production, can you invest in a dual booting CI so that you can test Rails 5.2 and Rails 6 simultaneously? If you invested in upgrading, it makes sense to invest in tooling for the future so that you can stay out of upgrade debt. So now that we've looked at considerations that you should take when upgrading, we'll now look at things that you will regret. I should not do that. There are a lot of choices that you can make in your application that will make upgrades or maintaining your application a lot more difficult. Something that you're likely to regret in the future is forking Rails. Don't do this. The choice to fork Rails and deviate from upstream was the single most expensive choice we made at GitHub in regards to our application. This had a compounding effect on the state of their code base that made our upgrade from 2 to 5 take 7 years. If you absolutely must fork Rails, you should try to at least track the upstream version as closely as possible and only backport bug fixes or features that you need. If you add features that you never intend to upstream to Rails, your fork is going to deviate from upstream and make upgrading really difficult. You also may regret falling behind on security upgrades until the point where Rails no longer supports your version. If you need to stay on an unsupported version of Rails, you should at least use something like Rails long-term support, because they'll maintain the fork for you and ensure that the security patch is correct. If you fall behind on Rails upgrades and end up writing your own patches, you may do it wrong and leave an insecure endpoint. In general, the best way to do any security patch is to rely on Rails upstream. Ensuring your application tracks the most recent version of Rails can reduce any surprises when you upgrade to that security patch. If you're also using old unsupported gems, your upgrade will be more difficult because you have to replace each of those dependencies before you can finish your upgrade. Ensure that you upgrade your dependencies often to keep in line with Rails requirements. This will also prevent you from ending up using a gem that gets abandoned by its maintainer, because Rails isn't going to require a gem that is no longer maintained. You may also regret using Rails private APIs. In Rails, private APIs are code that is purposefully undocumented or under the private namespace. We reserve the right to change these APIs without deprecation. So if your application is relying on them, they could be removed or changed, and you won't actually know except for having an error. It's always best to use public documented methods so that you know the Rails team will deprecate them if we ever intend to change or remove them. So all the things that we looked at and more can compound the cost of your upgrade. It's easy to see how these decisions cause us to accumulate debt in our application. I'm hoping by now you're feeling a little bit more confident that you too can do an upgrade. I know it's going to be hard. You might try. You'll definitely get angry. You may even curse past engineers that no longer work at your company. I did. I apologize to all of you. But I want you to know that you can do it. I have faith in you. You may be thinking, okay, well, Eileen, you're on the Rails core team, and you work at GitHub, and I'm not capable of doing an upgrade. It's too hard, and we just don't have the talent or the time. So I'm going to tell you something that I've told a lot of people, and it's true. And it's not because I want to pat myself on the back and have you all clap for me, but it's because I want you to know that you can do this. Before the Rails 3.2 to 5.2 upgrade, I had never done a major multi-version upgrade before and deployed it to production. If I can do it, you can do it. I'm not smarter than you, I'm not better than you, I just might be a little bit crazier than you. But you can totally do it. It's not going to be easy, especially if you've taken on cumulative costs that we looked at earlier. And while you're upgrading, it's really important to remember a few things. You don't have to solve all of your technical debt problems tomorrow. You can pay that debt down incrementally over time. Start with that weird class that you don't know what it does, or that uses a private Rails API. Remove or document your monkey patches. Identify and upgrade Rails dependencies that are out of date. Rails upgrades are a marathon. They are not a sprint. If you and your team incrementally pay down debt, the debt that you've incurred over the debt you've incurred, the upgrade will eventually be possible and completed. It's also important to remember that you're not alone. Many before you have done an upgrade, and many after you will do an upgrade. Find others doing upgrades at the same time, or folks that have done it in the past and we don't have for support. I knew that Shopify had just finished their own hard upgrade, and so I had them to ask, hey, is this ever going to be over? Or advice how to continue. And lastly, remember that the payoff is worth it. Upgrades take a long time, and they're really difficult, but being afraid of upgrading isn't going to make it go away. When you upgrade your application, it'll eventually be in a better place. In addition to improved security, easier hiring, and more manageable dependencies, doing the hard work of upgrading will give you improved APIs. Major version upgrades allow us to rethink how previous features in Rails worked and redesign them and rework them so that we can improve them for you. An example of an improved API in Rails 6 is the handling for multiple databases. Before Rails 6, adding multiple databases to an application was awful and very hard. You had to write a ton of code yourself, but in Rails 6, we've added new APIs for establishing connections, as well as an improved API for active record database configurations. Without upgrading, you don't have access to these improvements. Upgrading to new versions of Rails also improves security. In addition to security upgrades being easier, if you're not behind, Rails also adds new security features to protect your applications and your users from bad actors. In Rails 5, we introduced performance CSRO tokens, Rails 5.2 introduced encrypted secrets, and Rails 6 is shipping with improved security around potentially dangerous arrow methods. These features will help keep your applications safe and secure. Since these are security features and they're not vulnerability patches, the only way to get them is to be on a new version of Rails. And although Rails 3.0 is plagued by performance issues, newer versions of Rails have focused on better performance. The Rails team is always looking for areas to make Rails faster in all environments, and Rails 6 is shipping with a memory leak fix for view loading and development, and faster after support notifications. And other stuff that I cannot remember. Upgrading Rails also gives you access to new libraries. Rails 6 is shipping with new parts of the framework like action text, active action mailbox, one of the mailboxes, and write. By upgrading, you can rely on great new features in Rails without having to build your own infrastructure tooling in your application. In an ideal world, your application would contain only code that pertains to your product. If your product isn't about sending mail, you shouldn't have to write code that sends mail. The framework should just do that for you. Upgrading Rails helps you keep that line where your application ends and your framework begins crystal clear. And lastly, upgrading your application gives you a chance to contribute upstream. It's really difficult to fix bugs, add features, and influence the future of Rails from an old version. It's not a requirement to contribute if you're on Rails Master, but it definitely helps open doors that are otherwise closed. As DHH said in 2004, and many times since, frameworks are extracted. We build Rails from our existing needs. But if those needs are set back in Rails 2.3, it's hard to make a case for extraction that our application requires. All of these are good reasons to upgrade, but this is the one that kept me going. This is the reason that I spent 1.5 years on the Rails upgrade. It was so that GitHub could influence the future of Rails. For GitHub, this is the biggest and most important reason to upgrade. By upstreaming features, fixing bugs, and supporting Rails' future, we support our future as well. When I look back at when I started the 3.2 to 5.2 upgrade, the thought of being on a modern version of Rails and actively contributing upstream felt like an unachievable fairy tale. We were so far behind that often I wasn't sure that we could finish it, at least not while maintaining the majority of my sanity, although that's still questionable. But now, regularly contributing to Rails and supporting the future of Rails is GitHub's present and future state. Since upgrading Rails, GitHub engineers have sent over 75 pull requests to Rails 6 that improve performance, fix bugs, and add major functionality to Rails. Before we upgraded, we were often forced to monkey patch or work around bugs in overly complex ways. Using Rails 5.2 has allowed us to not just contribute upstream, but to make choices that improve our application instead of hinder it. And all of you here benefit from those changes as well. In addition to bug fixes and performance improvements, we've extracted major functionality from GitHub. We don't have time for technical details, but we've extracted our handling for multiple databases in Rails 6. We've used our knowledge and expertise on database handling to create an easy-to-use, robust new API for defining, establishing, and switching connections between databases in your application. We did this extraction not just because it benefits Rails, but because it allows us to reduce complexity in our own application. Our goal is to never fall behind ever again. We're investing in our application in Rails by doing continuous upgrades. Every single week, we bump our Rails gem and run all of our tests against the new version. That lets us find regressions in Rails quickly and fix them before we release that version. It also lets us test all of GitHub's code in Rails 5.2 and 6.2 simultaneously. Since we did the hard work of upgrading these major versions, this new process means that we won't fall behind again, because our upgrades are easy and we're doing them as Rails changes instead of many years later. Because of this, we're confident that Rails 6 is performant, stable, and resilient. Continuous upgrades and our contributions to Rails are evidence that for the first time in GitHub's history, we're not just using Rails or simply building a Rails application. For the first time in GitHub's history, we're pioneering the future of Rails. We're extracting code from GitHub, building new features into Rails that will help you scale your application, and giving back to open source to support Rails for the long haul. It makes good sense for us to do this. Not only do we give back to the community, but it helps us keep our application focused on our product. We can reduce complexity and improve resilience, all while contributing to the future of Rails. At GitHub, we not only need to do this for our own application and our own needs, but we have a responsibility to support Rails. We owe part of our success to the Rails framework, and we have the influence, expertise, and application to help push Rails forward. Upgrading Rails was a huge investment. It wasn't cheap, but it was so worth it. Upgrading Rails opens up a ton of possibilities for the future, and we have a bright path ahead of us. We're building features faster, we're more confident our code base is stable, we're improving the scalability of Rails, and we're giving back to the open source community. At a minimum, by upgrading, we went from being crushed by our application, Rails, and the decisions that we've made, to building up our application, to building up Rails, to building up our community. Upgrading Rails gave us the freedom and flexibility that we didn't have before. It empowers our engineers to build more and build better. In 2007, GitHub was born, and 11 years later, we're finally tracking master. It took 7 years from the day the 3.0 upgrade was started to the day the 5.2 upgrade was complete. The future is bright, and I can't wait to see what the next 10 years allows us to extract from GitHub, build in Rails, and how our community thrives. At GitHub, we'll continue to invest in the future of Rails and our community because we have to, because we need to, and because we want to. We'll continue to invest in the future because GitHub and Rails are in it together for the long haul. And I hope you are too. Thank you.